Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for participating in today's webinar. Today's topic is why next-generation antivirus is only best effort. Our speaker today is Guy, our product marketing director. Guy joined Sangfor this year as our product marketing director for Endpoint Secure, previously serving as the director of threat intelligence and web security product management for NS Focus, and with over 30 years experience in sales engineering, technical product design, technical marketing, and business development. Guy is a leader and ground speaker at the course of a domestic cybersecurity industry. So after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. Please type your questions in the Q&A module, and Guy will reply them one by one. Thank you. The webinar will now start. Let's welcome our speaker, Guy, from Sangfor marketing team.
Thank you, Sunny. Appreciate this. Welcome, everybody. Hope you enjoy this. Why next-generation antivirus is only best effort. There we go. So welcome to why next-generation antivirus is best effort. I'm going to talk about the threat. I'm going to talk a bit about why next-generation antivirus falls down. Then I'd like to speak about how Sangfor is able to respond to situations where customers have been infiltrated by ransomware, and some of the service offerings we provide to help be able to respond back and be able to continue business services. So let's talk about the threat. Some interesting statistics I want to talk about. Number one, 91% of all cyber attacks start from a phishing attack. Think about that. Someone clicks on a link, someone downloads an email message, something happens. That is what normally kicks off most cyber attacks. There has been year over year between 2017 to 2018, 2018 to 2019, there has been a yearly increase about 363% of ransomware attacks annually all throughout the world. Ransomware is a growing threat everywhere. Remember this number. AV-Test, one of the independent antivirus testing organizations, sees on average 350,000 new malware samples every day. New and different malware samples that are unique every day. And the cost to recover from a malware breach on average takes about $2.4 million. For those of you who don't know what ransomware is basically a specific kind of malware that takes over a victim system and then encrypts all the data that's on there. And once the data is encrypted, the attacker or the ransomware actually will send a message to the victim that says, hey, if you want to get your files back, you need to send us this amount of money in a ransom, usually paid in Bitcoin. The user is then given instructions on how to pay the ransom. Bitcoin is exchanged, and in some cases, and not all cases, some cases the attacker will provide the keys back to the user so they can decrypt their files. Ransomware is transmitted through a whole bunch of different ways. Let's talk about phishing is the number one way of doing it. There are other techniques such as worms, where ransomware piggybacks on top of other kinds of malware and is pulled down through exploit kits, where you have ransomware that comes in, it installs, it then downloads the malware from the internet and installs it. And all these things are taking advantage of system vulnerabilities. For example, WannaCry, one of the most successful, most prolific ransomware that has hit the internet, took advantage of a Windows vulnerability called Eternal Blue. The way ransomware works in an environment is the malware comes in and it infects the machine, and then it scans the network looking for other devices that it can try and infect. Once it finds these other devices, it will then try to communicate with these other devices and try to infect them using the same kind of exploits or vulnerabilities that it took over the first system. Once the ransomware has been rooted, it sits for a while, and then when a trigger happens, it'll start the encryption process. So the ransomware could actually sit for days, weeks, even months before it starts the encryption process. And then when the victim is least expecting it, it starts taking over the machine, encrypting all the data. And then once the data has been encrypted, a ransomware message pops up giving the victim instructions on where to pay the ransom to and what to do at that point. Now, historically, if you look at ransomware, the biggest victim targets for ransomware has been enterprise and education, because those are the easiest to exploit, and those would be the ones that are most willing to pay ransomware. Government is also in there because attackers realize that government organizations, especially local government, is very susceptible to potentially loss of service, loss of revenue because they can't collect revenue from taxes and other kinds of things if all their systems are shut down. So these are the key places that you see people being hit by ransomware, and they tend to be the most vulnerable of all the organizations that are out there. I'll give you an example. TSMC is a major manufacturer of semiconductors in Taiwan, and they were hit by ransomware in 2017 into 2018, but basically the ransomware took over in August of 2018. At that time, the ransomware spread throughout several fabrication facilities, so they had to stop manufacturing semiconductors across several different plants, all the machines being locked down. By the time they were able to recover, by the time they were able to start production again, over the course of several days, based upon the loss of sales, loss of revenue, missing target commitments, and other types of things, and the cost of actually trying to fix all this big ransomware infection, it came out to a loss of over $170 million US, probably the biggest ransomware financial impact to date in a single organization. In fact, it was so bad that when the quarterly reports came in, TSMC stock actually dropped 15% when they made the announcement because how big this loss was. Luckily for TSMC, none of their core data was lost, so they were able to continue manufacturing, but it was a huge wake-up call in terms of realizing they needed to do something to fix this in the future. This year, Riot ransomware has been the most prolific strain of malware that's out there. So far to date, it's hit over 100 companies worldwide, and it has been projected that the attackers have collected over $3.7 million US from small governments, local governments, healthcare organizations, and education and enterprise. And one of the reasons why this has become so prolific is attackers took a different approach. Attackers took a different approach where they came to realize that the organizations they were going after had cyber insurance. And when they had cyber insurance, they realized the cyber insurers were willing to actually pay the ransom without asking any questions, because the insurance companies realized it was cheaper to pay the ransom than it was to try to recover business operations any other way. The time, the investment, potential loss, and payout they had to go do. So attackers came to realize, oh, these insurance companies are going to pay, we're going to hit more of these organizations, so we know they're going to collect on the ransom. I've talked more about this. I actually posted a blog post a few weeks ago, so if you go to the Sangfor blog, you can read my post called Wreck Ransomware and You, or I'm No Fool with Cyber Insurance, and we'll post a link for that blog after the presentation is done. So the reason why you're here, why does Next-Generation Antivirus fail? Why does it fall down? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of antivirus. First, antivirus kicked in 25, 30 years ago with basically a technique of looking at malicious files, suspicious files, being able to create a hash signature like an MD5 or a SHA-256 hash, and then anytime they saw a suspicious file similar to that, they would just hash that file and compare the hash to what was in the library database. 15 years ago, that worked out really great because there wasn't a whole lot of new ransomware coming out all the time. People would see stuff and they could, within a few days, distribute these new signatures when zero-day ransomware came out. As time went on, and we're seeing tens of thousands of new ransomware malware samples coming out every day, the antivirus database became unwieldy because now it had to become so big, I had to be able to try to match across tens of millions of records to be able to find a match. And you see that malware is changing on a daily basis. It has different variants because attackers have come to realize if they make a minor modification to the code in the malware, then the hash changes and it's not going to match on the database. So the database technology has become obsolete and we've moved on to other kinds of things. So we moved on to what's next generation antivirus, which is where they've added not just the database matching technique, but they've added artificial intelligence, they've added behavior heuristics, trying to see, well, how does the file actually work? If I look at how the file works, and I can see the things it does on the machine, how it modifies the registry, and other kinds of stuff that it does, look at the memory, maybe I can identify the ransomware based upon that. But then again, attackers came to realize if I know how the ransomware works, and I can modify its behavior slightly enough, then the behavior algorithms are going to not see it. Or I can actually train the behavior algorithms by including valid file behavior in my malware. And when I do that, the AV is going to look at it and say, oh, it does regular behavior, it must be okay. So when the malware does something bad, the antivirus, next generation antivirus just ignores it. We then went from there to endpoint protection platforms. We took next generation antivirus. We added other things to it to be able to try to protect the endpoint by doing things like vulnerability scans, by looking at behavior, by trying to do whitelist and blacklist. At the same time, another category of endpoint software came out called EDR, or endpoint detection and response. These are companies that realize, you know what, the malware is going to get through, and when the malware gets through, we have to figure out how to respond to it, so we're going to figure out how we're going to be able to respond to these bad things. Well, what's interesting over the course of the last few years is you're seeing a lot of endpoint detection and response functionality now appearing in endpoint protection products. So things like Symantec and Sophos and Kaspersky are now starting to do these detection response type things. At the same time, what the EDR products discovered was they need to have some kind of screening process up front. They need to have some kind of detection process because there's so much stuff happening from a response perspective that they need to pre-screen, make sure they can detect some of these malware files ahead of time just to reduce the processing overload on the endpoint. So what you're now seeing is this conversion between endpoint protection products and endpoint detection response products, where they're all basically very similar in terms of functionality. But they all use basically next generation antivirus as a primary detection mechanism looking for malware. Why do we care? Well, there are independent organizations that are out there like AD Comparatives that goes out and tests on a regular basis all the antivirus, next generation antivirus, and next generation malware products, EDRs, to see how good they are at detecting zero-day and known malware. And what you find out on the course of any given test, some days they do better, some days they do worse over the course of the year. But on average, if you actually look at the data on average during the year, all antivirus is about 99.5% successful. And this is where the next generation antivirus falls down. Now, why is it only 99.5% successful? Why is it not 100% successful? Well, because number one, it can never be 100% successful because the attackers are going to be building smarter malware, different malware, and they're looking for ways to circumvent and bypass antivirus products. Two, the antivirus products believe they're going to find everything at 100%. So they tell you, we're going to detect it and we're going to block it. But again, when it's 99.5%, it doesn't see it, something's going to get through, and that's where the problem is. The behavior analytics techniques don't work because malware has become modular. They can inject new kinds of code in there. They can change the way the behavior works. There's a new strain of malware for Android phones that recognizes when it's in a sandbox, because what it does, it looks for the accelerometer. It looks for the little device that actually sends the walking data that your phone tells you how many steps you took. And if it doesn't see that real-time data coming, then it knows it's in the sandbox and it just shuts down and goes to sleep. So it's very difficult to analyze this type of malware because the sandbox can't see it. There's still a lot of belief that signature databases are good because, again, the more signatures I have, the better chance I have finding something. But if I'm seeing 350,000 new malware samples every day, and most of those are variations on the theme, they're going to have slightly different hashes. And again, my database is going to become so big, it's so unwieldy, just to scan through tens of millions of signatures takes a long period of time to be able to identify a problem. But the biggest issue is how they handle the response. If they assume that they're going to detect everything and block it, they don't really spend a lot of time on the response. What to do when that one piece of malware gets through. That's the part that they have to worry about. And the response is inadequate because if you look at the timeline of most infections that you see that from the initial attack, because someone clicked on a phishing link, something bad happened, that the initial compromise of a system takes only a few minutes. And then from the time that that first compromise happens to the time that data is sent to a command and control server and it's looking to expand to other systems nearby and be able to spread, takes also another few minutes. So basically, you could be infected and spread to other machines within 5 to 10 minutes. Then becomes the issue as well, you have systems that are infected by malware. When do you discover you've been infected by malware? The malware goes to sleep for a period of time and waits for a trigger like a holiday or a weekend or something. It could be days, weeks, even months before the malware is discovered. And then once the compromise is discovered, how long does it take to repair the breach? And be able to mitigate all this malware, find it, get rid of it, and be able to return to operations, and that can take weeks to months. What you find out is 85% of those 91% of all cyber attacks started by phishing, 85% of those happen within a few minutes, usually 5 to 10 minutes. And then from a discovery point of view, on average, especially in Asia Pacific, it takes about 229 days for an organization to discover they've been infected by something. And by that time, it's very difficult to try to remove the malware because it's spread so far and is rooted so deep in an organization. So why is next-generation antivirus best effort? So let's go back to the fact that we've got this average 99.5% detection rate. So again, if it's not 100% successful, something is going to get through. At least one thing is going to get through. And then remember, A/B test says they see 350,000 unique files every day. Every day. Now think about that. If I take 350,000 new files every day, and I can take away 99.5% of those bad files, because that's my success rate, I still have the potential of seeing 1,750 files getting through my antivirus, because my antivirus is not 100%. That means the potential for ransomware to get through is quite high. And people say, well, I've got antivirus now. I don't really think I need to worry about that. Well, WannaCry, as we talked about before, was the most prolific ransomware until this year, and it infected 200,000 machines in 4 days across 150 countries. In fact, it almost wiped out, single-handedly wiped out the entire Chinese university system because of every university in China was infected and all the systems got shut down. But here's the thing that's interesting about ransomware. A recent Barclays Insurance Company study was performed, and they interviewed companies that were infected by ransomware because they have to make the payouts. And what they found out for the last 12 months is 100% of the customers that were infected by ransomware successfully all were running some kind of antivirus. And 95% of the ransomware somehow was able to bypass the traditional firewall. And 77% of the ransomware was able to get past email gateways. So it was more than just phishing links. And what you find out is it isn't always phishing. It isn't always coming from a link on a website. You have people that take their laptops home and they get infected surfing the internet, doing bad things. And then their systems get infected. They bring it into the office next day. They plug into the Wi-Fi, and boom, that box is now looking for every other box on the corporate network and tries to infect everybody. Or somebody will bring a file in, a joke file or a video file or something in on a USB stick and give it to somebody and plug it in, and that USB stick is infected. So there's a lot of ways for malware and ransomware to circumvent all the traditional um, network perimeter techniques. So what can Sangfor do to try to help you solve a ransomware problem? Well, if you look at the Gartner adaptive security model and we try to adapt it to how to work with ransomware, you need to be able to predict when you're going to see stuff happening. You need to prevent the ransomware from coming. You need to be able to respond. You need to be able to detect. And here's the thing. In most cases, people are trying to work on the prevent side, and the prevent side is never going to be 100% successful. Sangfor believes if you dedicate more effort to the respond side, you can find it faster, and then you can be able to get rid of it faster. So Sangfor has a very different approach to defending endpoints because number one, we don't believe that endpoint protection by itself and next-generation antivirus is alone capable of being able to stop ransomware infecting systems. Sangfor has a world-class malware analysis engine that we call Engine Zero that's in many of our products. But again, we know it's best effort because we know it's 99.65% successful. It's not 100%. So we know something will eventually get through. It'll block lots of stuff, but something's going to get through. So we concentrate on the response. We want to be able to identify from the endpoint perspective, if something gets through, how does the endpoint detect it quickly? How does it try to contain it, prevent the spread? And here's the thing. I might be able to contain the spread on a laptop or a desktop, but I might not be able to contain the spread if it's on an e-commerce server that's generating $100,000 an hour because I don't want to shut down my revenue generation system. So I have to figure out some way of containing any infected system and make sure it doesn't propagate across that. So we can integrate with other Sangfor products like the Sangfor Next-Generation Application Firewall, NGAF, and our Internet Access Manager, IAM, to be able to prevent hosts from spreading the infection laterally across and communicating to command and control servers out to the internet. And here's an example of how we talk about this. You can see here we have our cloud threat intelligence. Our cloud threat intelligence provides analysis to our Engine Zero anti-malware analysis system. It sends updates to the NGAF to be able to identify threats coming in. If it's seeing signatures for new malware coming through, the NGAF will scan files as it comes in from websites. It scans as it comes to emails to see if it can block those. And again, they'll try to block those if it catches those. Then we go ahead and we have our Endpoint Secure endpoint protection product, which is installed on the endpoints and is able to also use Engine Zero to detect malware as it tries to come and install itself on the machine. But in the event that malware does get through by passing our detection engines, then the Endpoint Secure software and the next generation firewall can work together to try to contain preventing the spread of the malware and the ransomware and preventing the malware from communicating out to command and control servers so they cannot download botnet instructions and so they cannot pass SSL keys so they won't start the encryption process right away. So we have predictive attack capability with our Engine Zero. It's a multi-stage engine. Different parts of it are in different parts of our product. So the next generation application firewall has several key components to be able to look at network-based malware attacks. Endpoint Secure has additional stages installed to be able to do things like real-time sandbox analysis. And anything that the NGAF or Endpoint Secure cannot find, we can then send up to our cloud, to our Neural X, to be able to use our cloud-based sandboxing to try to understand if this malware is suspicious or malicious. Engine Zero, in conjunction with Neural X, is a very powerful malware analysis engine, and we have shown that with known malware, we have a high detection rate of 99.9%. For unknown, we can actually do 99.65%. So we're very good at detecting unknown zero-day malware and zero-day ransomware. In fact, we actually discovered global imposter ransomware when it first came out earlier this year, when it was unknown, and we actually detected 100%. But again, we know on average, we're not 100% detecting everything. So we consider our engine 0 to be best effort in terms of detecting and blocking. So now we want to concentrate on the response, the detection and response. So using Endpoint Secure, endpoint protection, use next-generation firewall, we have the ability of looking at suspicious activity and helping to validate if a file that we see is actually ransomware. Being able to do ransomware verification and help you identify based upon behavior, heuristics, and other things, the kind of family the ransomware belongs to help us be able to do a better job at mitigation and removal. NeuralX provides global threat data to the next generation application firewall and endpoint secure so that we can relate global threat data and global ransomware and malware data to what's happening locally to better identify the things that we see. The nice thing about our holistic solution is I can see from the firewall perspective and I can see from the endpoint secure perspective behavior that can help me identify bad things. So the firewall is looking at communication from the endpoint going out and around to identify suspicious, malicious types of communication based upon known malware behavior. And endpoint secure is telling us based upon the heuristics, the behavior analysis of the endpoint, it's seeing bad things. The firewall, endpoint secure map this behavior together to be able to correlate and identify whether they actually see real malware spreading and trying to do other things in the environment. One of the ways we can do this is we can display these communications in Endpoint Secure. And you can see here if it's normal allowed communications, it's green. If it's red, that means suspicious, unauthorized, unknown communications going between an endpoint host to another endpoint host or to a server or going out to the internet that shouldn't be allowed. If the firewall sees this kind of communications, it'll actually go back and ask the endpoint that's doing the communications, hey, we see some weird stuff happening. Can you go out and do a self-scan, run a vulnerability scan on yourself, and tell us if you're doing anything wrong? And the endpoint can then say, yeah, it's software we installed, it should be okay, or no, I've been infected by something. Block those ports to make sure that nobody else infected can get out to the command and control server as well. And again, we can see both these views from the firewall side on the network and from the endpoint side. Sangfor Endpoint Secure has a revolutionary ransomware honeypot. Every endpoint has honeypot capability built into it. And what it does is it allows us to identify specific directories, specific files that are potential to be encrypted quickly or at the beginning of the ransomware encryption process. When we look at these bait files and we see a bait file that we're monitoring and it starts being encrypted, we can then identify the process that's doing the encryption. Once we identify the encryption process, we can go in and kill it. Endpoint Secure then says, well, I know here's the process. The process I can now map to a specific application. Once I've identified the application, I can then go ahead and either kill or quarantine that application too. That allows us to very quickly identify when ransomware is in play and be able to stop it. We don't guarantee being able to prevent encryption of all data files, but we can certainly minimize the level of encrypted data on a given system and to ensure that the ransomware doesn't spread across to other systems. And we look at our response, we have one-click response capability, which means in my management console, either on the firewall or for Endpoint Secure, if I see infections that are happening, I actually have the ability to, from the console, do a one-click fix and be able to remediate from a single host, or if that same malware is spread across multiple hosts, I can actually, through a single click, force all the endpoints throughout the environment to remediate that same file. And the way one-click kill works is once Endpoint Secure identifies malware on the endpoint and identifies that it's bad, then the Endpoint Secure Manager says, I've got this signature, I know this is bad, go run a scan across all the other systems that are out there, see if you can find this file. If you can find this file, let me know. Once the manager is informed that there are multiple instances of this file throughout different systems in the environment, then the administrator is notified, and the administrator has the option of being able to kill it either by quarantine or deleting the files from the management console. We also need to prevent the spread of ransomware or malware in general. And the way we do that is we also have the ability to one-click isolation, which means from the management console, if I see a system that's being infected by malware and ransomware, I can automatically disconnect it from the network. So that means now it is logically cut off from the network, and all communication ports are shut down through micro isolation, and the malware and the ransomware cannot communicate to other devices running scans or trying to spread. This way we can prevent anything from going out in the environment. But again, the problem is if I'm running on my $100,000 an hour server, I can't shut that server down. I need to be able to communicate with the internet because I'm processing orders and doing e-commerce. So what Endpoint Secure can do is Endpoint Secure can work with the next generation application firewall or internet access management products and say, you know what? We need to contain this malware to this particular zone. And we want to make sure we can block all communications that go across zones. That way we can let the commerce server continue on, do what it needs to go do. If it tries to spread outside of the DMZ or wherever the e-commerce server is located, we'll shut those connections down through the firewall and IAM. Okay. So what becomes important is you need to have a multi-dimensional detection and response for doing ransomware and malware in general. I can't just do it by endpoint by itself. I have to work in conjunction with other technologies because there's a network component, there is an endpoint component, the threat intelligence component. So by being able to use the strengths of these different types of core products and being able to do things like real-time vulnerability scanning and patch management, I can identify when endpoints need to be identified and patched up to be able to try to minimize the effects of malware. It also gives me the ability to do full asset tracking of all the devices that are out there, and I can do compliance monitoring. My threat intelligence is providing real-time black and white lists to be able to keep the endpoints and the firewall appraised of new threats that are coming in and being able to update those policies in near real time. We've got the one-click host isolation to ensure that we can prevent the spread of the malware across domains or from a specific host. And we've got the one-click automatic file disposal capability, which means I can either delete or I can quarantine the file. And if you work with our Sangfor hyperconvergent infrastructure, where we have a huge cloud infrastructure that we can use to back up the data. If you use HCI in conjunction with Endpoint Secure and the next generation firewall, and you use it to back up your devices in real time, in the event of a ransomware attack and you don't get the keys, you can easily go to our HCI infrastructure and be able to recover lost files from the immediate backups. And we're doing backup in near real time very quickly. We have the ransomware honeypot, and we have malware sandboxing both in Endpoint Secure, in the manager, and in the cloud. So we have multiple ways of detecting and identifying malicious files. And again, by integrating our devices together to be able to provide a more holistic detection and response system, it is the key to being able to minimize any type of ransomware attack in any environment. A lot of people may not be interested in Sangfor products directly, but Sangfor does have some ransomware service offerings that could be of interest to customers. We have what's called the Sangfor SIP, which is a management platform that allows us to be able to pull threat intel data together and to be able to integrate with other devices to be able to identify threats, be able to identify potential things like malware and ransomware that can be coming to an environment and being able to map those threats from global data back into the local threat data we see from different kinds of devices. We have solutions where we can take our cloud-based service offerings and we can help smaller organizations by doing managed services, cloud services to be able to manage their firewalls, to be able to manage their endpoints, and being able to do incident monitoring and tracking so that in the event there is an infection, we can notify the customer in real time, hey, you had an infection, we're trying to respond to it, here's what we need you guys to go do. That's been a very, very popular service offering. We also provide ransomware solutions for larger enterprises where they can take SIP and other components and build their own infrastructure, their own private cloud capability to be able to provide the threat analysis, threat detection capability in their own environment. And the last thing I want to talk about for customers is Sangfor does offer a free ransomware incident response service. You can contact us on our website if you've been infected by ransomware. We will get back to you as quickly as we can. And what we'll do is we will help you assess what happened, how you were infected, where ground zero was, what was the malware and the ransomware that's infecting you, what's the potential of being able to recover from that, being able to determine what we need to do and help you with a remediation plan to be able to get your business operations back online, to see if we can provide you the tools to help you decrypt the files if we have them, and then provide you a plan to how you'll be able to mitigate this stuff in the future. We've actually had this service available only about 4 months now, 3 months now, but I can tell you that in the last 6 weeks, we've had over a dozen customers worldwide contact us to use our free ransomware service. And just to give you an example, here are 3 case studies recently that happened in terms of using a ransomware service. We had a government customer from China that was infected by WannaCry. We were able to determine if they had backups, get their backups back online, determine what the ransomware was, get rid of all the infected files, be able to install Endpoint Secure quickly to be able to ensure that a reinfection could not occur. And we were able to get this done usually in half a day. So for this particular government customer, we handled dozens of systems within half a day. We had an education customer in Malaysia that was hit by Grand Crab, and it spread very, very quickly. Luckily, they were a Sangfor HCI customer, so they were doing automatic backups to the cloud. And because of that, we were able to identify the ransomware strain, remove the ransomware that was in there, install the Endpoint Secure, and quickly recover all the encrypted files. And they were down for only a few hours. That was a very exciting thing for us. And lastly, we actually had a customer, an enterprise in the UAE, in the Middle East, that was hit by Phobos. They were infected by ransomware. Unfortunately, they didn't have any backups. We did try to recover as many of the files we could using our decryption tools. We did install the Endpoint Secure to be able to ensure that there was no reinfection that came down the line. We did vulnerability scanning to identify how the Phobos came in and identified a patch process they need to go to ensure that this didn't happen again. So though customer C was not as successful in terms of recovering the data, they were very grateful for the fact they were able to contain the ransomware within a given area. Though there was some loss, they now have a plan going forward to ensure this doesn't happen again. And this has been very, very successful. I said in the last 6 weeks, we had over a dozen customers doing this. So if you are infected by ransomware, please contact us, and we'd be very happy to help you solve your problem. So again, with our professional services, with our cloud platforms, with our on-premise platforms, Sangfor believes you have to have a holistic way of being able to detect and respond to malware and ransomware. One product by itself is not going to be able to do that because today ransomware is so sophisticated, it's smarter than any one product. And with that, I thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
Okay, thank you for your sharing, Guy. We will now have a Q&A session. Please type your questions in the Q&A module, and Guy will answer them one by one. Thank you. Okay, here we got the first question. I don't not understand how the ransomware honeypot works. Could you please explain more?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yes, our honeypot technology is very unique in terms of how we do this. And what Sangfor Threat Intel has done, our Farsight Threat Intel Labs has done, is we've analyzed hundreds of different types of ransomware that's out there. And we've looked at the mechanisms they use for determining what directories and what files that they go after. What we've done is, based upon this analysis, we have started monitoring the directories most likely to be encrypted. And then what we do is we install bait files with similar names to the kind of things that the ransomware is looking for, key documents and such. And then we track those files. We're actually monitoring those files in real time to see if they're being touched. And the minute we see the file is being modified, we then determine what is the modification that's happening. Is someone opening it? Is someone trying to copy it? Or is it being encrypted? If we identify it's an encryption process, we identify the encryption process very quickly in terms of what's running on the system, and then we automatically kill it. So that stops all the files from being encrypted from that point on. One or two files might be encrypted at that point, but again, that's better than the entire system being done. But more importantly is once we've identified the encryption process, we can then look at the processes running on the system and we can see that this application, this file, this program is what was running the encryption process. And then we can go ahead and determine where that file came from, and we can either delete that file or quarantine that file to ensure that it doesn't run again. Client already has antivirus and you install Sangfor's Endpoint Secure product, what happens to the installed antivirus? That's a very good question. Sangfor Endpoint Secure recognizes that you may already have an antivirus product in there and you're very happy with it. So what we want to do is we'll go ahead and let your existing antivirus product be primary, and then we act as secondary, which means your antivirus product is doing the detection. It's trying to see when malware is coming in, it's going to block it. However, if your antivirus misses it, then Sangfor's Endpoint Secure is able to detect when your system becomes infected, and it will then take steps to act upon that. If the file decides to become dormant before it does any bad behavior, Sangfor Endpoint Secure can be scheduled to run regular scans on a scheduled basis, on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, looking for new files, looking to see what happens, and then being able to identify if a new malware file was being able to get your system. So we have several different ways of being there to back up your existing antivirus. Okay. Okay, so the question was, one of the listeners here already had an antivirus solution in there, and then they discovered they had been infected, and the antivirus didn't find it. So the question is, what could we do with Endpoint Secure to see if it would be able to identify something like this? And that's a very good question. So we've been very, very successful in going into places where they had infections that happened, where they had systems that had been running antivirus, and being able to identify based upon behavior that's happening on the system, based upon communications happening on the system to other devices, if they are being infected and something bad is happening. At that point, Endpoint Secure can take this information, map it to, again, known malware in terms of doing something bad, and identify whether or not this particular file should be deleted, in which case it will notify you in the management console, or if you're an existing Sangfor firewall user, in the firewall console that says, here's what you need to remediate this particular file. So if you've been infected for a while, our services and our products have been very good at being able to determine latent infections and help remove them over a quick period of time. Okay. One more question. So customers saying, well, I use a well-known antivirus, and they didn't say what the name was, and Guy Rosewell, would claim that their product is best effort compared to Sangfor. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying Sangfor is better. I'm saying that Sangfor Endpoint Secure Engine 0 is best effort like all other next-generation antivirus, because no product, whether it's ours or anybody else's, is not 100% able to detect all malware all the time. And again, if you go back, you don't believe me, go to AV Test or AV Comparatives, two organizations that independently test antivirus products, and they'll show you on average their detection rate that they've seen is about 99.5% for almost all the antivirus products that they tested. Question is, Liz would like to know how far the education sector has been affected, and are there any affordable devices that they can use to consider for this? Well, endpoint products are now becoming commodity. They're all very, very cheap. The issue is not how expensive the endpoint product is. The question is, whatever product you use, can it solve your problem? So you need to make sure that, number one, contact Sangfor and let us determine whether or not you are infected. And if you are infected, then we can help you determine a course of remediation at no charge. Based upon that, then you can look to see if you want to purchase our product, which is very affordable, especially to education, because we do have education organization discounts. And then we can certainly help you try to solve your problem. Can Endpoint Secure detect and prevent advanced persistent threats? Yes. In actual fact, advanced persistent threat is another name for zero-day malware, the new types of malware. And what's interesting about zero-day malware is malware is very different than it was 3 to 5 years ago. 3 to 5 years ago, there was some guy who lived in his basement in his mother's house, and he wrote code, and he wrote this big application, and he released out the world and did lots of bad things. Today, that malware has been weaponized. It's actually been rewritten and modularized by criminal organizations. And what they've done is they've actually made it modularized so they can actually plug in new payloads like DDoS or crypto mining or ransomware, or put in more than one payload or do other kinds of things. So it becomes easy to use the core of one type of malware and then be able to do many different things with it. And the thing about advanced persistent threat was, well, how do I detect these new and evolving types of malware? And that's what APT is. So yes, Endpoint Secure would be very good at being able to detect the majority of new zero-day APTs that are coming through, and then be able to identify if you've been infected by them after the fact. Listeners asking, many other vendors are talking about having AI embedded in their antivirus detection capability. We talk about how ours works and how does it compare to other antivirus solutions. That's actually a very good question. Everybody talks about having antivirus artificial intelligence, and many of them do. And there's many different kinds of artificial intelligence. There's heuristics, there's neural networking, there's behavior analytics, and most of them are using behavior analytics. They look at how does the malware operate on the endpoint, what processes does it do, what does it, communication channels does it does. So if I can try to look at what the normal behavior of an endpoint is, and I see the behavior change in a way that's not expected, that tends to be the smarter way of looking at if something bad is happening. Endpoint Secure and Engine Zero actually has 16 different AI engines built into it, and they all do different kinds of things. And one of the things that's core to us is what we call gene mapping. As I said before, today malware has been modularized, but it's still based on about 35, 40 different core families. So one of the things that we can do is we can look at the malware and we can fingerprint it by saying, you know what, if I look at the gene, if I deconstruct it, look at the code, I will see that there are parts of the code that belong to this family, because very easy to understand if it belongs to this family, then I know I can take these kinds of steps to at least shut it down and then deal with the payload afterwards. Think of it as this. Think of it as the fact that I've taken a DNA sample of you, and then I sent it to a place that does DNA analysis and ancestry comparison, and I see what your ancestor family history looks like. Then I take a close relative, a cousin maybe, take their DNA, and I compare it to yours, and you see there's going to be a lot of matches because you're both the same family. But now let's say I take somebody from a perfect stranger that's several cities away. And lo and behold, there is a slight match between their DNA and your DNA, because though you're not directly related, if you go back several hundred years and several generations, you'll find that you might have a common ancestor. So you know you belong to the same family. And that's the same kind of thing that we do, is we're able to detect even the smallest connections between current malware and existing families to be able to help identify where the malware belongs to and how to mitigate it. Does that make sense? What's the footprint of Endpoint Secure? I found Endpoint from the markets for taking huge resources on the endpoint. That's actually a good question. endpoint products, depending on what you take, are different sizes. They take a lot of memory, take a lot of footprint. Endpoint Secure in and of itself uses less than 200 megabytes of RAM when it's running, and it uses less than 250 megabytes of disk space sitting on the disk there. So it's very, very lightweight. It uses very, very minimal processing, and it doesn't take up a whole lot of resources on many systems. How often does Sangfor antivirus engine 0 update? It updates in real time. So whenever our threat intelligence Neural X platform sends out new updates, they're automatically pushed out to our threat intelligence platforms, or our threat intel platform can have the data pulled from them. So Endpoint Secure can actually be scheduled to pull data on a regular basis, either daily or hourly, as is required. So there's two ways for Endpoint Secure to be updated. Okay. That, I thank you all for your time. Again, we'll be posting this recording online here shortly, and we'll make a copy of the presentation and a link to the blog post available at that time. Thank you all for your time.